Welcome to Unit 2B, Malaria Parasite Biology, Immunology and Epidemiology in Areas Approaching Elimination, Section B, Changing Epidemiological and Geographical Patterns. In this unit, we are going to use what we learned in Unit 2A related to the biology of malaria and development of immunity and apply it to understand changes in the epidemiology of malaria in areas approaching elimination. By the end of this unit, you will be able to describe changes in the population at risk of infection and disease from malaria as areas approach elimination, explain how the geographic distribution of malaria changes as transmission declines to very low levels, and explain why malaria transmission becomes more concentrated along border regions as transmission declines. In high transmission or high burden areas, the key groups are children and pregnant women because they suffer the most severe consequences of malaria. In very low transmission settings, children and pregnant women are at very low risk of infection and are no longer the key groups. Let's review who is at increased risk of infection when countries get close to elimination. We saw in our discussions on immunity how the groups at risk of severe disease and infection change as transmission declines. In high transmission settings, children and pregnant women are at the greatest risk of severe complications from malaria infection, and the malaria community has paid special attention to interventions that reduce infection and disease in these higher risk groups. This very important work has led to innovations in vector control and malaria treatment and reduced the burden of disease significantly since 2000. Now, let's consider very low transmission settings approaching elimination. Compared to high transmission settings, there is a significant change in the groups at risk of infection. Because of the low infection rate, children and pregnant women are no longer at the highest risk of infection or severe disease. Instead, malaria largely becomes a disease of occupation because most transmission occurs outside among people who have occupations or activities that keep them outdoors between dusk and dawn. This includes people who farm or harvest trees in the forest or mine for precious minerals. Military personnel who may patrol at night are also often at increased risk, as are people who engage in the outdoor leisure activities, travelers, and mobile and migrant populations. Let's review some of the evidence that tells us that these groups are at the highest risk of infection in very low transmission settings. In areas approaching elimination, as we just mentioned, it is the adult population that is most at risk because malaria tends to become an infection of people who live, work, or spend their leisure time outdoors. This slide presents data from the Cambodia Malaria Indicator Survey in 2013. Using polymerase chain reaction, PCR, they found 119 positive infections in more than 8,500 samples. Males over the age of 15 were the largest category, representing 43% of the cases, and females over 15 accounted for 27%. Together, adults made up 70% of the cases. This is very different from the age distribution you would see in a country like Uganda, for example. The survey also looked at different risk categories. Among residents who did work in the forest, the proportion who were PCR positive for malaria was 1%. Among travelers, defined as those who had slept away from home in the previous 6 months, the positivity rate was double that of residents, 2%. But among residents who did work in the forest, defined as those who had slept overnight in the forest in the previous 6 months, the proportion positive was 5%. In Cambodia, a country that has a very low overall risk of malaria, there is an increasing concentration of malaria in a very narrow demographic and occupational group, that is adult men who work in Cambodia's forest. But is this pattern found in other eliminating countries? Here are data from two countries that had fewer than 100 cases total in the few years before the data were collected. In both Malaysia and Costa Rica, one country found in the Western Pacific and the other in Central America, more than 80% of malaria cases were identified in adults over the age of 15, and more specifically, half of the cases were in adult men. This pattern is repeated over and over again in countries approaching elimination. Malaria generally becomes a disease of adult men, or to be clearer, malaria becomes a disease of those whose occupation or activities led them to spend time outside late at night or early in the morning. While we see this pattern across many countries, it is important for all programs to analyze their case data to understand the specific risk groups in their country. We have reviewed how decreasing transmission changes the groups at highest risk of infection and diseases. Now, let's examine the change in the geographical distribution of malaria as transmission declines. I am going to play a video that simulates the patterns of malaria in a country that is eliminating and shares a border with the higher burden country. You can consider each pixel in this video as a small village or hamlet that is a collection of houses. The color designates the proportion of the population infected with malaria. Those colored red have a high prevalence of malaria, and those in shades of light pink have a very low prevalence. Gray means there are no cases. The area in white is not receptive to transmission. Over time, you will see that high transmission areas in red shrink in size, and there are more areas with very low or no transmission. As transmission declines, malaria becomes more and more focal and restricted to certain areas. This is a feature of declining transmission. Malaria cases become more focal because they are associated with areas that have conditions more favorable to transmission. As transmission and the number of cases declines, the health authority in the area is able to begin implementing case investigations. At first, the health teams focus on differentiating between local and imported cases, but when the case numbers get very low, the health teams begin differentiating indigenous from introduced cases. At the very end of the simulation, you will see that the last indigenous cases shown in red are mainly occurring along the border with the high burden country. After the country pictured in this video eliminates malaria, only imported or introduced cases are found, and most of these occur along the border. As we saw in the video, as malaria transmission declines, cases are likely to persist for longer along international borders with higher transmission countries. Why may this happen? Because border areas do not generally stop people or mosquitoes from crossing, meaning cases are easily imported. Imagine a village that has all of the elements required for transmission: abundant mosquitoes, good larval habitat, and a susceptible population. If insecticide-treated nets are distributed to 100% of only the eastern half of the village, the effective coverage of the area at risk is just 50% because half of the population in the transmission area didn't receive ITNs. Cases of malaria will continue to occur on both sides of the village, just as they will on both sides of the border because interventions aren't reaching the other side. In addition, border areas have traditionally been sites of conflict between neighbors, deliberately or inadvertently neglected or simply very remote. Therefore, These areas may be underserved by malaria prevention and treatment interventions compared to other parts of the country. In the end, eliminating countries bordered with their higher burden neighbors have an increased risk of transmission because interventions coverage is likely to be lower and there is increased risk of importation. We will talk more about border malaria and cross-border collaboration in Unit 9 on prevention of reestablishment. We have just seen data from several malaria-eliminating countries that show adult men as the group at highest risk of malaria. Take a moment to consult with your neighbor about the higher risk groups in your country. Why are these groups at higher risk of infection? What are the risk factors such as their occupation or behaviors that put them at higher risk? Finally, how is your program working to address these groups? In sum, as areas increasingly control and prevent transmission of malaria, the risk of infection may shift towards people with outdoor exposure to mosquitoes. In areas bordering higher transmission settings, transmission along the border may persist longer than other places in the area. Malaria cases along international borders may be the last to be eliminated.